couple of weeks I made a tutorial where I took a short time frame of only about half an hour, and I took that time to model this medium poly tiger tank that you can see right here. Now, the point of that video was to show you guys that you don't have to spend 2 weeks to create a decent looking tank. You can do it in only about half an hour. Now today we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to create some textures. And I'm going to do two things to create those textures today. I'm going to use some procedural materials to create some edge masks and to create some edge wear on this tank. And the technique I'm going to show you, I learned that from CGVirus. He has some very good videos on procedural materials. I'm going to link them in the description, so be sure to check those out. And after that, I'm just going to do some texture painting to add some more detail to those textures that we create. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to select our turret, and we're going to go over to the shading tab. And when you do this, make sure that you are in the cycles render engine, because this is not going to work in Eevee. And we're going to go over to our rendered view. Now, before we start doing anything else with the materials, we have to make sure that we UV unwrap this object right here. So just smart UV unwrap that, and just have that on the side over there for now. And once we do that, we can go ahead and create a new material. And in this material, we're going to delete our principal node because we don't need that one for now. And when we delete that, we just have this black object here with no shading or colors or anything like that. So we're going to go ahead and create a bevel node. Now, with that bevel node, we're going to have to combine a geometry node, which we're going to place right underneath the bevel node. And we're going to put those two together using a vector math node. Now, we're going to plug the bevel node into the top part here, and the normal node from the geometry node into the bottom part right there. And we're going to combine those two using the dot product instead of the add. That's very important. Make sure you set dot product there. Now, we're also going to add an invert node. And we're going to plug the value from the dot product of the vector node into the invert node, and the color from the invert node into the surface of our material output. And as you can see, now we start seeing some white edges around this otherwise black object. And we're going to go ahead and set the samples in our bevel node to 10. And I'm going to increase the radius just a little bit to about 0.1 right there. Okay, so now we're going to select these 4 nodes that we created without the material output. We don't need that one. We're going to select these 4 nodes, and we're going to press Ctrl G just to create a new group with these nodes. And we're going to plug the 2 plugs from the bevel node into the group input. And the group output is already sorted out, so let's just leave it at that. And then press Tab to leave this little menu, and we have this new node right here called Node Group 001. And we're going to rename that to something that we can recognize, something like Edge Mask, because we're going to create this node afterwards to create the same edge mask for all the other objects in this tank. So we're going to leave that right there, and we're going to go ahead and create a new image in our image editor right here. So let's create a new image. Let's name that turret underscore mask. It doesn't matter what you name it, just make sure that you remember the name. We're going to leave the dimensions as they are. We don't want this to be too high resolution. This is a medium poly tank, so a lower quality texture is going to be good for my purpose right here. You can go higher if you want to, but for this video I'm just going to go with 1024. Make sure you uncheck the alpha and make sure you check the 32-bit float. And let's go ahead and create that texture. So now we just have a black image right here. And we're also going to change the color space into non-color. Now once we do that, we're going to go ahead and create an image texture back in our material right there. And we're going to open up the image that we just created. So let's open up the turret mask right there. And let's not plug that into the material output. So just leave that on the side here. And with your turret selected, we're going to go over to our render properties, and we're going to go down to the bake settings. Now here we're going to bake this these white edges onto this image that we just created. So let's go ahead and set the bake type to emit. And at that point we can just press the bake button. And once that finishes baking, you're going to see that this image you created on the side looks a little bit different. It looks like we have some white patterns in the shapes of the UVs of this object. And now we can use that image to create some procedural materials and make some worn edges. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to plug this texture mask into the surface of the material output instead of this edge mask node. We can delete that node. And we can leave the rendered view now because we don't need that, because now this is an actual image which is displayed on top of this object. And let's also add a principal node just to make this texture look a little bit more realistic. Most of the materials you're ever going to make, you're going to need a principal node, with the rare exception of something like an edge mask, like I showed you 2 minutes ago. But we're going to use this edge mask now to create some rusty edges. Okay, so let's run this texture mask into the base color. But before it joins with the principal node, we're going to go ahead and add a math node, and we're going to use that math node to increase the intensity of this edge mask on the surface of the object. We're going to set the math node to power, and we can control how intense these white edges are now. But instead of doing that with this slider right here, I'm going to do something else to make these look a little bit more messy. I am going to add a noise texture, which I'm going to plug into the exponent there, so color into exponent, and I'm going to run that through a very simple color ramp. So let's put the color ramp in between there, and let's set this noise texture scale to something like 13. Let's increase the detail a little bit. Let's put that to about 2.7 or 3. You can play around with it and see what works best for you. I'm also going to increase the roughness just a little bit, and then I'm going to change this color ramp into something which is going to give me a little bit more of these messy shapes all over the rest of the object. So let's set the black slider to somewhere around just below this little pointer down here, and let's set the white slider to somewhere a little bit closer to the black one, somewhere around there. I think this looks pretty nice. Now this is going to control the shape of the patterns that we see on our surface, but it's not going to control the intensity of the final product that we have here. So in order to control that, we're going to add another color ramp after the power node. Okay, so let's add another color ramp there. Color ramp, and plug it right here. And for this one, we can control how sharp the edges are going to be. Now if we increase this black slider, you're going to see that they become a lot thinner than they are initially. But if we decrease the white slider, the edges are going to be a lot sharper. You can see that this way, when the white slider is all the way in the end, the edges are not very sharp, they look pretty soft. But if we bring it closer, they're much sharper and the colors are a lot more intense. So we're going to bring those two pretty close together. I'm going to pull the black one a little bit further down because I want to have some thicker edge wear here. Let's even see if we can play around with this a little bit more to make some more wear on the sides. But anyway, you can play around with this as you like and create the result that you want. So I'm going to work with something like this. And then once I plug this into my principal node, I'm going to use this edge mask to control two different textures. So the black color is going to declare where we have a surface metal texture, and the white is going to declare where we have a simple rust texture on the edges of this object. So let's go ahead and create a mix shader node, and that's the one where we're going to plug in the two different textures. Okay, so we're going to plug the color from the color ramp we have in the end here into the factor of this mix shader node, and now we can control which two colors we're going to have there. Let's set the color 1 to something like red, and let's set the color 2 to something like blue. Okay, as you can see now, we can change these colors as we want to. Now, of course, as you would imagine, you can also plug an image texture into these colors. So instead of the red color, we can have any color that we want or any picture that we want. And of course, we're going to create a node Wrangler with Control T, and we're going to use these 3 nodes to create a simple texture for that. And I'm going to use a very basic metal texture that I downloaded from the internet, and I'm going to use that for the base color. And then for the other color, for the edges, I can change that to anything I want. I'm going to go with a rusty color. But if I just set a color here, that's not going to look very good at all, as you can see here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another texture using some other nodes to make this look like some more realistic rust. And we're going to do that by adding a noise texture. So let's add a noise texture here. We're going to plug the color into the second color, and then we're going to run another color ramp so we can control the different levels of different colors that come out of this texture, the noise texture. So we can take this noise texture node and we can increase some of the numbers here. Let's set the scale to something like 14. Let's increase the detail to something like 9 or 10. Let's see how that works out for us. And I am also going to increase the roughness just a little bit, but as you can see, it doesn't make too much of a difference. Now the reason it doesn't make too much of a difference is because we don't really have any colors here. It's just black and white. It doesn't really look like anything. So we're going to play with these colors a little bit and give it a little bit more of a rusty look. So if we change the black color, it's not really going to make too much of a difference here. But let's set the white color into something like a dark brown color, something that you would imagine you would see on a rusty texture, some kind of dark brown color. And we're going to add a few more pointers here on this color ramp node to give it a few more, to give it a bit more color variation. Okay, so let's set another one here. We're going to set that to something a little bit more red. We're going to add another one in between those two. We're going to make it brown. Just play around with the colors and just pick whatever you like, and it doesn't really matter too much anyway. But you do want to make sure that you bring those sliders together a little bit, because that's going to make the colors look a little bit sharper, and it's going to create a very specific texture on the surface of this rust. So it's going to look a little bit more realistic. So if you bring them together, it works much better. And when you're happy with the result you got, don't worry about how it looks now. It looks a little bit blurry and you can't really see much of a texture. But we're going to plug that into a normal map or into the bump map afterwards, and that's going to start looking much better. Now let's do that right now. As a matter of fact, let's create a bump map, a bump node, and we're going to plug the color from our mix shader into the height, and we're going to plug the normal from the bump node into the normal of our principal shader. And now we're going to give Blender a few seconds to load this in. And as you can see now, this surface looks a lot more bumpy, and you can see that the edges have a different height than the textured material, than the metal around the rest of the tank. Now this is a little bit too intense. The bumps are a little bit too high. It doesn't look very good at all. So we're going to change the strength to something like 0.4. We're going to change the distance to something like 0.4, and that looks a little bit more realistic now. We can see that it looks like the surface is kind of scratched, the paint is worn out, and we can see the rust revealed below the paint. Now the problem with this is the rust is a bit too shiny, and we can control that by creating a roughness map. And in order to do that, we're going to add another mix shader. We're going to duplicate this, and we're going to bring it above the mix shader that we had before. And we're going to plug the color ramp that we plugged into the mix shader that we created first. We're going to have that control the levels of roughness across the tank, right? So the color number 1 is the roughness of the metal, of the main texture that we have, and the color number 2 is the roughness of the rust. Okay, so if we plug this, let's remove any colors. Let's make that black and white just so I can show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to plug the color into the roughness, and as you can see now, the paint is quite shiny, but the rust is not shiny at all. Now I want to add a roughness map to the paint, and I want to have the rust so it's not shiny at all. Okay, so the rust is going to be completely white as it is right now. But we're going to take this node and we're going to add another node Wrangler there. And with this node Wrangler, we're going to open up our roughness map, and then that gives us a slightly nicer look on the surface of our tank. So that's pretty much all we're going to do for the turret for now, and we're going to have to do the same thing for the hull. Now we can't just use the same material on the hull because it's not going to have the same edge mask. We have to bake a new edge mask, and then we can use the same nodes again. So let's select the hull of the tank, and let's add a new material, which we're going to name hull, just so we know, just so we can differentiate between the two. Let's also name the turret material turret. And for the hull, we're also going to add our edge mask node, which we created from the group of the different nodes in the beginning. We're going to plug that into the surface. You can go to your preview so you can see your rendered view, so you can see that the edges are there. I'm going to stay in texture view because it's a little bit faster. And we're going to add another image texture node right there. We're going to delete this texture from this object here, and we're going to create a new one. We're going to name this one hull edge mask, and make sure you check the same settings as before, 32-bit float, okay? And make sure you set that to non-color. And now we're going to open that image up here. We're going to open up our edge mask for the hull, and we're going to go back to our render settings. Make sure you have your bake type to emit, and we're going to bake that texture. And now that we got our second texture mask baked, we don't have to go through all the trouble of creating all the nodes again. Let's delete this edge mask here. We can just duplicate them from the first material we created from the turret and just change a few things up, like the edge mask. Okay, so let's select all these nodes here, except let's also select the principal node. So let's Control C that, and then in our material for the hull, we're going to paste that with Control V. Okay, and now one thing we have to replace here is our edge mask. So we're going to use the one for the hull instead. We're going to plug that color into the base of our power node, and let's plug the principal node into the material output. And as you can see, we start getting the same texture patterns on the hull of the tank now as well. Now, if you want to, you can change some of the settings for the hull. You can make the texture look a little bit different if you want. You can make it more or less fine. You can change the shapes here using some of these sliders on the color ramps. But I'm gonna keep the shapes pretty much the same, so the texture is pretty much the same on the turret and the hull. Now we're also gonna do the same thing for the other parts, such as the wheel right here. We're going to take the wheel, we're going to UV unwrap that over a new texture. So let's add a new texture. I'm going to make this one only 512 by 512 because this is a small object. I don't really need a very detailed texture for this. Let's add a new material there. Let's also bake another edge mask on top of that. We're going to add an image texture. We're going to plug the edge node into the surface material. And we're going to select our wheel mask for that. Okay, wheel mask, let's make sure we name that correctly, and then we're going to very quickly bake that once again, and then we're simply going to do the same thing again. We're going to paste the same node setup here, okay, and we're going to replace our edge mask with the one that we want to use. So we're going to take the wheel mask, let's unplug that from the surface material, and let's plug that into the power node, and let's plug the principal node into the material output, and that's going to give us the result that we want to see. Now maybe you want to change the rust shapes a little bit more on this particular object. I like to make them a little bit larger, a little bit more rusty. So I'm gonna play around with some of these sliders and make sure that the wheels are a little bit more rusty. I feel like since they're closer to the ground, they get more wet, so they get a little bit more damaged over time by the wetness of the ground. Now I'm not going to go through the trouble of separately unwrapping every single one of these wheels, so I'm just going to duplicate this wheel and place it on the location of all these other wheels. So I'm going to delete all the wheels, and I'm going to snap the textured wheel into the location of that one using my 3D cursor. I'm going to go around and I'm going to do that for every single wheel. I don't care too much if the patterns are all the same because it's not really that noticeable, and that pretty much textures our wheels. And now we can separately control the materials for all the wheels at the same time. Okay, so let's go ahead and change the colors a little bit. I want to make these a little bit less saturated in color. All right, I think it's going to look a little bit cooler if the colors are a little bit less intense. If it looks like they're a little bit more muddy than rusty. And we're also going to add another one of these edge masks for our sprocket. Okay, so let's select a sprocket. Let's add a new image for that. We're going to keep the same dimensions because it's still a very small object. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to add our edge mask node, which I'm going to plug into the surface of the material output. And I'm going to add an image texture, which I'm going to set to my sprocket. Okay, sprocket mask. And also make sure that you set this to non-color data. And we can just go ahead and bake this again. And once we bake that, we're going to once again do the same thing. So we're going to paste all the other nodes here. We're going to replace the image texture with our new image texture that we want to use for this. So we're going to use a sprocket mask instead. And let's plug that into the power node right there. And let's also plug the principal node into the material output surface, like so. And then I'm going to duplicate this sprocket onto the other side of this track set as well. And now one thing that we're going to do slightly differently are these tracks here. For the tracks, I'm not going to make the edges worn out. I'm just going to add a simple rust image texture on top of these tracks here. So I'm going to add a new material. I'm not going to bake anything. I'm just going to add a node Wrangler, where I am going to open up a simple rust texture. Let's increase the roughness and let's reduce the specular. And I just want my tracks to be completely rusty like that. I think that looks good enough, and I think I'm going to keep it like that. Now I'm also going to add another edge mask for my gun. So now that we have this texture applied to the whole body of the tank, I'm just going to duplicate my tracks really quick first because I want them to be the same on both sides. I'm going to select all these tracks and wheels on the left side which are not textured, and with my 3D cursor in the middle of this object, I'm going to select the tracks on the left side of the tank, and I'm going to duplicate them across the 3D cursor, across the y-axis, and I'm going to just flip the normals to make sure that they are calculated correctly. And now we have an almost fully textured tank. Now after we're done with the procedural materials on this texture, I'm going to go ahead and finish this by texture painting. I'm not going to show you that in this video because I have another tutorial where I texture painted my M1 Abrams tank, so be sure to check that out if you want to see how to do that. Now if you like this tutorial and you want to learn more about making tanks in Blender, please consider subscribing to the channel, and also don't forget to check out CGVirus. He has great procedural texturing videos. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you around.